Good morning, everybody. My name is Jim Anderson. I'm the General Manager of Network Infrastructure and Audio Visual, and I have with me as a co-presenter today Troy McDermott, who's the IT Enterprise Architect for the IT group here at CEC, and we're going to do a brief presentation. Hopefully it doesn't become the 37 minutes of tech. We can keep it to 20 on endpoint protection for remote workers and securing data off-site. So, like many of you out there, we all report to physical offices. You can see the map of Iowa and Wisconsin here. You can see that we have offices in Ankeny, Waterloo, Hiawatha, Dubuque, Davenport, Madison, Milwaukee, and De Pere. And before the pandemic hit, we were all showing up on site to these offices. And then after the pandemic, this kind of became what our office environment looked like, and I did my best to put in some surrounding areas of our offices where some of our people live, and this very much became our reality and what we were dealing with. So one of my responsibilities as the head of the IT department is to worry about how we were going to implement a safe and efficient environment going into this new, our CEO calls it the New World Order. So some things that we had to consider. We wanted to make connecting back to the office easy, and I left off and secure, because what most of our users care about is the ease of use. So, you know, Troy and I, we have to worry about making that secure so that our company's data and all of our interactions aren't compromised. So this is an important thing to consider for the user experience. The next thing we had to deal with was device protection. This means a few things. One thing we have to consider is asset management. Where are our assets and who has all of them? And are they being patched regularly? Are they getting regular updates for applications and operating system? Also, do they have a standard endpoint protection across the environment? And is that endpoint protection being updated regularly, which can present problems if it's not? Another important consideration is device encryption. So this means two things: data in transit or data in motion, and data at rest. Troy's going to talk about the data in motion piece later on in his piece of this presentation. I want to talk about data at rest. So when it's sitting on your hard drive of your end user's devices. Do you have BitLocker? You know, we use the Sophos product here. Do you have something that encrypts that data when it's at rest? Because you have to worry about devices traveling outside of your walls more now, and that just leaves them open and vulnerable for theft. And if one of your users' devices is stolen, will company data be at risk? And we want to protect against that. Another thing that you have to consider is email protection. You know, we're using a lot more email and video conference now that we're doing more work from home. Hackers are actually using the coronavirus, the name of the coronavirus, and the urgency of situations to their advantage. And so they're creating false information, false emails out there that impersonate maybe IT staff or leadership staff, asking you for things that maybe haven't been asked of you before. You know, so we just really want to make sure we're educating our users about that, and that they understand that we have regular methods of communication, which is important. If we're going to send out information to people across the company, typically it's only certain people that do. There's only certain people that have access. So if someone is communicating to them and it's not someone who they're used to seeing communicate on a mass level, you know, we're trying to educate people not to consider those emails and to delete them. You know, and the best thing you can do is consult with your IT staff. You know, they're going to know, they're going to see these trends, they're going to see things that are happening. Ask them if it's a legitimate email, and don't feel foolish for asking. One thing that we try to do is utilize phish testing, and that's with the PH phish, email phishing. So we will send out test emails that have links in them that people can click on that will lead them, in our case, not a malicious spot, but it could. And then we see the people that are clicking on those links, and then we reach out to them after the fact and try and educate them on what types of trends are in false emails and help them understand the ramifications of clicking on a bad email like that. Cloud storage, I put that with a question mark. Some people are using it, some people are not. Probably most people out there are like CEC. We use it for certain things, and then we have other methods. Really, if you can, put multi-factor authentication into that, just multiple ways of authenticating, right? And I'm not going to dive into that because Troy's going to get into that here in a little bit. But, is this the most secure way of doing things? I mean, that's a trick question. The answer is probably no. Anything that's contained in your walls is usually more secure than something out in the cloud. But I ask that question because these are things Troy and I consider when we're implementing them into our own organization. We want to make sure that we are thinking ease of use, which cloud storage definitely has, right? All you need is an internet connection. You don't need to establish VPN or anything like that. And so we like that piece, but we want to make sure that we're putting secure options out there for our users as well to protect them. Removable storage devices. The first thing I'll say about this is never use these devices in your environment. And then I just used the never word, which we're not supposed to do. So when people start using them in your environment, do you have an endpoint protection that you can enable to scan these devices? Something that would at least give you an extra layer of protection for when people in your environment decide to use these. Okay, I've hit my last slide, and this was something I will admit I was a little bit blindsided by in this pandemic environment, in this work from home environment, the absence of physical IT staff. So if you remember, the first thing that I put up was make connecting back to the office easy. This accentuates that point because I didn't realize that not having people, IT staff, readily available that you can just walk in the door and ask them a question would actually deter people from using the proper channels of methods of communication, the proper channels to contact IT people. And so we have had some people out there that were trying to fix their own problems and doing more harm. And then, like I said, we didn't see it coming, but then I was finding out about some of these issues through leadership meetings, which was crazy because so-and-so had someone they supervised that experienced some issue, and I was finding out about that and having to send it back to our IT people to fix it. So I've reached the end, Troy, of mine, and so take it away.
All right, Jim, thanks for that. I had to find my mute button there. I'll go ahead and get things going here. I'll share mine. I'm going to talk more on the remote access kind of implications of working from home now that that's become a lot busier than what it was in the past as far as how many people are doing it. Just going. So again, pretty short here today. I'm just going to go through this a little bit. We'll talk about 4 things that I think in the past weren't as big a deal when you had 5 or 10% of people using VPN or working from home. When you start to approach 75 or 80% or even 90 to 100, these things are probably worth spending some time on to see if they can make things work a little better. Again, I think a lot of us had kind of a panic mode where we got VPN working and we're good to go. And I think now that we've kind of gotten into it a little bit, it might be worth going back and re-examining some of these things and making a plan that, okay, we're going to make some changes down the road so that, if we keep working from home with everybody or we have to go through it again sometime, we've done some of this work ahead of time and maybe we've got something set up a little bit better than what we had to do in a weekend when we knew it was coming fast. So the first thing I'll talk about really quick is just user group architecture. Not everyone needs everything. You generally probably have some power users, and then most of your users are probably more general. A good example is, for us being in IT, a lot of times we have an IT VPN profile that can get to everything on the network, every switch, every access point, every firewall, every router. Ideally, that would not be the same profile that the general users would be using. And again, it's one of those, like, is it insecure or not? You can't really say. It's more just about reducing attack surface. And it's not that we don't trust employees, it's that we know employees have devices that could get infected. We maybe don't trust all of the software running on our devices. We've got endpoint protection, we've got device encryption, we do a lot of work to try and keep that from getting to be something malicious. But if it does get malicious, ideally that VPN endpoint can only get to a subset of the entire network. And sometimes that'll require some architecture changes on the Office side of things. If everything runs on, if all your files are shared off one server, if all your applications run off one server, it's a lot more work to say only parts of that server are available. But if you've got that architecture set up, we've got things tiered, roll that out to the VPN side of things too, and kind of restrict people down to just what they need. Authentication methods are another thing worth talking about. When only 10% of the people are using VPN, it's pretty easy to just tie it into Active Directory and call it a day. When you start to have 90% of your employees are using VPN, that means 90% of them need to have secure passwords to avoid having something be brute forced or somebody's password getting out in the open. A good way to mitigate this is to move to two-factor authentication, where it's the old adage of you log in with something you know and something you have. So you've got a password that you memorize, and then you've got either a hardware token, a little device that basically switches a code every minute, and you put that code in. That way, if your password gets out, but somebody doesn't have your token, they can't use your password to get in. If you lose your token, it's no good without the password. And those are the two factors there. We've seen a lot of improvement in this field in the last several years, where now a lot of times we're using just a software token. It's an app on your phone. You go to log in with your password, and it will, either prompt you for a code from your phone, or it's getting even easier now where it may just prompt your phone and say, hey, I see you're trying to VPN in. Would you like to approve that? Now, as long as someone doesn't have your phone and your password, it's a pretty secure way of doing things. It's something now that, when you've got most of your workforce VPNing in, might not be a bad idea to look at that and say, is that something we need to budget for next year? It's definitely not something you roll out in a weekend. It's a lot easier than it used to be, but it's still not quite that, we want to do two-factor authentication by Thursday. But I would say at least kind of look into it, see what your options are, find out what it would cost, and then you can make that decision of whether it's worth it or not to you. Split tunnel is something that it kind of gets talked about by the IT nerds, but it's definitely something worth talking about. We've seen problems come from having it, from not having it. I'll do a really quick little diagram just to kind of explain what split tunneling is, and I guess when I use that phrase. Basically, let me give you a second to look at my kindergarten level drawing schools here. But of course, the internet is always a cloud, so we'll draw that up here. We've got our home worker over here, and this is Troy at home on his laptop. And of course, I've got my path to the internet there, and then we've got the multi-story office building is where the resources I'm trying to get to are, and of course, that most likely has a device here. I'm not going to draw the bricks on the firewall and the flames like most network diagrams have, but basically then when it comes time to get to my files, I'm doing this path here, and then I get to the file server back here. I'll draw my file cabinet there. So I've got access to that. The question comes when, how do I get to the internet? So if we're doing split tunneling, it refers to basically a VPN tunnel that goes two different directions. So split tunnel traffic goes right to the internet, where if I'm doing non-split tunneling, it takes this same pathway, goes to the firewall, makes a U-turn, and goes back out to the internet. So that is non-split. If I'm doing non-split tunneling, I can basically force everything through this firewall over here, and I can examine the traffic, I can content filter, I can do all that. If I'm not doing that, if it's over here taking this red path, then I don't have as much visibility or control over it through my central firewall. Now, I'll say two things to that. One, if you're running a good enterprise endpoint protection solution, that's not a problem because your endpoint software can do that content filtering and search for malware. And on top of it, a lot of people like to have that non-split tunnel. Well, that way we can force everything through the corporate firewall. That's true as long as the VPN connection is up. Basically, when people are going to want to bypass that, they're just going to drop the VPN, go out their normal internet connection. So, and that's why I put it in the description here. It offers somewhat the illusion of control. I'll go back to my PowerPoint here and see. Get this again. So yeah, it says that we get more control. In reality, I don't know if that's as much truth. And on top of it, it does add a fair amount of latency, and it will use additional bandwidth at the head end. So one other thing to consider is tunnel access or portal access. It's one of those where there's a portal access system that, we've used it in the past when it's maybe not an employee, it's a partner or a vendor or something, and they really only need access to, just one web interface or maybe just an RDP session. We can limit that. This kind of follows into that. Does everybody need access to everything? So portal access is something that may work for, you've got one web application that some of your employees, that's all they need. You can really cut down that attack surface a lot and just give them access to that one application. One other thing I'll throw out there too is hardware endpoint devices. It can range from a small firewall basically to a dedicated VPN tunnel hardware endpoint, some of our partners make. And what that will work well for is if you've got people working from home and it's more of a permanent setup, and they not only do they have their laptop or tablet, but maybe they've got a printer or an actual hard phone, and you've got multiple devices, rather than have 3 tunnels and have to worry about having a solution that works for 3 different types of devices. There are times where it makes sense to have a small hardware device, and it basically turns it into a small remote branch office. So that's something too to consider if you look at some people and their setup at home and what it requires, and especially if there's some sort of device that they need that you can't install a VPN client on. It's much better to put a small firewall in or a small hardware tunnel endpoint and go through that to get back. So in trying to keep it down to 20 minutes, that's kind of rapid fire. We've got a Q&A panel through Zoom. If you've got any questions, I would say feel free to type them in there. Otherwise, I'll put my contact info and Jim's contact info up here. Anyone that knows us knows that we're more than happy to talk about this stuff at length. It's really a challenge for us to fit it in 20 minutes. So feel free to send us an email or get in touch with your account manager. We're more than happy to sit down with anyone and kind of talk through this stuff. Yeah, that's kind of it. So I think we made our deadline. I've got 11:19. Yeah, Jim, I don't know if you've got any questions or anything else you want to say, but I think we made it.
Well, let's tie it together. So I focus more on the endpoint, you focus more on the network, and that is clearly where the two of us sit better in those seats. So can you make that connection for me between the endpoint protection layer and the firewall, let's say? And you briefly mentioned it, and maybe talk a little bit more about the importance of that on a network.
Yeah, I mean, we always talk about how, a lot of it used to be pretty common. They're like, oh, I've got a firewall, I'm protected. I got a hard, crunchy shell and a soft, chewy center, and nobody can get in. And the truth is, if firewalls can, they do a lot, but they can't do everything. Endpoint is critical to that. Well, once you leave the nest and that device goes outside, then that endpoint software becomes even more critical. So again, then we're using that tunnel to extend that hard crunchy shell, but it's still not a complete solution unless you have good endpoint software as well. So the two things really go hand in hand in my mind.
Agreed. Yep, thank you. And I see no questions, so I think we made our 20-minute deadline. Troy, congratulations. All right, thank you, CEC Marketing. Thanks for those who attended, and I think we're finished.